It was a disaster, but it came out really well.
I thought it was fun. I had fun. I had a good time.
Okay, I was just worried that you would not like it. I don't know. I was just worried. I get stressed.
You need to worry less, my friend.
I get nervous about people doing the podcast and feeling bad or not enjoying it, or I feel worried about talking over the top of it. I just get worried about the podcast.
I didn't expect that from you. I was also very worried about, I feel that I interrupt people a lot in conversations. Like that's just how I have conversation. And I was acutely aware because you like don't like wait till someone's finished speaking, and so I had to put my hand up when I'm ready to say something.
That's a generic rule. That wasn't aimed at you. That wasn't a character assassination. That's a normal thing
Okay.
that everyone does. And I used to do it a lot, so that's why I'm acutely aware. I would listen back to recordings of myself and be like, "Do you want to shut the fuck up?"
Do you want to stop talking?
Hello, welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for people who like to chat books. Today it is me, Sarah, and I am joined again by Belle. Back again. We are both coming to you from Australia today. Belle is coming to you from Naarm, also known as Melbourne, and I am coming to you from Nipaluna, also known as Hobart.
Hello. Very happy to be joining. I met up with Sarah and Chris earlier in the year to discuss memoirs. I thought maybe actually I should introduce myself this time. Since last time we were having some technical difficulties.
Yeah, can I tell them what happened? Last time I was very flustered about a microphone issue. And if anyone who knows me, I'm easily upset. And I sort of lost my prowess as a as a podcaster. So that episode, it came out all right in the end, I think, but the recording was a bit of a shambles, to be honest. That happens sometimes.
I think you did a really good job editing the shambles out of it. It ran smoothly. As far as the audience could hear,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
But then unfortunately, so we had some weird sound issues as well. And then unfortunately Belle didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. So you seem like the quietest person ever, which is entirely my fault. I can only apologize for silencing your voice, but I'll make it up to you today. I'm not going to say anything. I'll just sit here.
Okay. I'm going to run the entire podcast. So my name's Belle. I have been a patron of the pod since, I had to look this up actually, 2020 when Sarah joined the pod. I am a good friend of Sarah's, loosely sisters-in-law, I guess. Our respective partners are brothers. So there's that fun connection too. And I am currently living in Melbourne. I am a junior doctor. I'm working towards being a paediatrician, so I'm working at the Children's Hospital here in Melbourne this year, which is lovely. So I have moved from Hobart, where Sarah is now, to Melbourne just to make things a bit more difficult. So as we're both coming to you from different parts of Australia today, I thought we should do a quick welcome to country. So we'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're coming to you from today. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening today.
We're going to talk about the Stella Prize today, but you do that event. I'd sort of like to talk to you about it.
So I attended a Melbourne Writers' Festival event, which was a session with the Stella winner. So I bought a ticket for that before the winner of the Stella Prize had been announced. I thought we might talk about it at the end because I didn't know whether we wanted to talk about the winner straight away.
All right, cool. Well, you're the boss. So we're going to talk about the Stella Prize today. The shortlist thereof and the winner. The shortlist and the winner thereof, even. Let's use good English. So the Stella, for people who are not familiar, it's essentially like the Australian version of the UK Women's Prize for Fiction. But it's for women and non-binary writers in Australia. They have to be citizens or permanent residents of Australia. So it's a little bit different to the Women's Prize, actually, in that respect. In the Women's Prize, you just have to have a book published in the UK. So you don't have to be a UK resident. But this is for people living in Australia, basically. We did talk about it quite a lot we did a long list episode with Sean the Book Maniac where we talked about the Stella Prize, we talked about the Women's Prize, and we talked about the Carol Shields Prize, which is kind of the Canadian version, the Canadian US version of those two prizes. So listen to that episode if you haven't already. But the long story short is that the Stella Prize judge, they take fiction, non-fiction, poetry submissions, graphic novels, short stories, all sorts of stuff, provided there's a substantial amount of text, apparently it says here in the notes. So we've both read the whole shortlist pretty well, is that correct?
Yes, that is true. I was always a little bit jealous of you guys when you do the Booker long list or shortlist episodes, because I thought it sounded fun to sort of set yourself a goal of reading a shortlist. So I listened to that episode with Sean and thought that it'd be fun if I committed to reading the Stella shortlist, which is why I suggested this episode to you.
I want to know, first of all, what do you think of that experience now? Are you still jealous of us when we say that now that you've actually done it? How do you find the experience of reading a shortlist? I find it inherently stressful.
Yes, I think it was. It was more stressful than I thought. It also happened at a time where I think you've touched on, funnily enough, in the grief episode, where it was a time where I usually would not read, or I would stop reading, because as soon as I committed to it, my grandfather started the process of dying, which sort of ended up happening early April, and I didn't do a whole lot of reading over that time, and so I had even less amount of time to get through the shortlist. But it was really nice actually having a reason to keep reading through that time when I know that I usually would have not read a book since. So mixed emotions about it, but on the whole, really enjoyed that I've now got my book count up, because it was looking pretty grim.
Yeah, mine's pretty grim this year as well. I'm trying not to think about that fact.
Mine is very grim compared to yours, so you are fine.
I don't think so. What's yours?
I honestly think that this makes it like 10.
Okay, I'm literally on, for someone who, I was going to say makes a living from a book podcast. I don't.
Do you?
That was a lie. That was an active lie.
News to me.
Right. Do you want to read? You've got some beautiful quotes here. Some beautiful notes. Is the yellow, what's the yellow highlighting mean in your notes?
Oh, I don't know. I think it just copied and pasted like that.
Right. Belle's done all the notes for this episode. She's absolutely done the basically everything. It's like I'm the guest. I've just rocked up like, hello. Do you want to tell us about the Stella a little bit with these lovely notes that you've got?
Sure. I found some lovely quotes from the Stella Prize judging panel discussing the shortlist, so I just thought I'd pop them in here. So Alice Pung says that although all the books on our shortlist are very different, common themes emerge about a woman's relationship to her art and to the world around her. All our shortlisted books also explore with moving complexity some of the most pivotal relationships in a woman's life and their roles as daughters, partners, wives, and mothers. And Jacqueline Booton, who is a creative director and co-CEO of Stella, says of the shortlist, these books are powerful works of literature and they embody the strength of women's writing in Australia. And I just thought that was a lovely summary of the shortlisted books, which are in We Come With This Place by Deborah Dank, The Jaguar by Sarah Holland Batt, Big Beautiful Female Theory by Eloise Grills, Hydra by Adrienne Howell, Indelible City by Louisa Lim, and Bad Art Mother by Edwina Preston. I was going to ask you, did you read any from the long list that weren't in the short list?
No, I haven't read any of the other books in the long list. I was quite interested in The Furies, which was supposed to be about different women's anger. So I was interested to read that, and I would have read it had it popped up on the shortlist. Most of them, to be honest, I really wasn't familiar with. I just don't follow Australian publishing like anywhere near as closely as I should. So yeah, I no is the answer to that question. You?
No, I had not. I think I'd looked at the date the shortlist was announced and decided just to wait before starting to read anything, so that I didn't read something that wasn't on the shortlist and add yet another book to my list of books to read.
Cool. So shall we go through the 6 books of the shortlist? We'll talk about them, what we thought of them. We'll rank them, I suppose. All right. Shall we start with We Come With This Place by Deborah Dank?
Absolutely. We Come With This Place is a memoir written by Deborah Danks. I think I would call it a memoir. Deborah is an Aboriginal woman of Gundagai country. I thought this was a deeply moving story of country and First Nations people, what it means to live on country and strong family connections, what it means to be parents and grandparents, raising generations of children to live on land Most of the book is written from the perspective of the author, Deborah, thinking back on her childhood, growing up the child of a stockman as she raises her young family herself. True to Indigenous culture, much of her writing is centred on the land as a living, breathing organism, I guess, rich with knowledge and power. And Deborah explores this vivid, rich history of the land that she grew up on. I've got some quotes as well. It's the only book that I put some little tab notes in, because I don't know, sometimes I think that the writing itself, of course, will speak more eloquently than I am able to, but I thought this little snippet, am I allowed to do this?
Yeah, of course.
This little snippet just gave a very good sort of insight into how she writes about the land and the sort of deep history of the land itself. There was silence now that wrapped around the landscape, getting everything ready for sleep. Cattle occasionally stamped and bellowed, and there was a sporadic metallic moan of the old windmill several kilometres away. But these noises didn't sit in this country, they sat on top. We listened carefully, and through the strange new noises that didn't have a story here, we heard the quietness of the old stories drawing nearer. Night was coming, and it was time to sit with that silence and move closer to the fire. So that is a small passage where she's talking about being a child, growing up. They lived on the land where her father worked with the cattle as a stockman, and a lot of her childhood, because they were an Aboriginal family, they lived basically on the other side of the fence to the sort of main house, or where the white families who owned the land and all the cattle lived. So her story was in We Come With This Place, her story is interspersed with stories told from her father's perspective as well. His name is Soda. It's about his journey into adulthood, growing up narrowly avoiding being separated from his family by various laws which tore First Nation families apart in Australian history. And as a young man, he escaped the cattle station where he was sort of put to work as a child and journeyed across the vast country, guided by his unique knowledge of the landscape, able to outsmart the white station masters who were hunting him for some of this time. And I actually have another quote which I loved. I think I read it out to my partner when I first read it. The earth turned red in the afternoon light. His walk, the soft, repetitive thuds of his heels continued to echo in his heartbeat. Walk softly upon the earth, and the spirits would be kind. It was a memory that sat somewhere safe within his soul. So that was sort of part of his journey walking, which you can imagine was probably hundreds of kilometres. So I thought that this memoir was equal parts growing up on country, Deborah's pervasive love of country, as much as it was about uncovering the injustice that was done and that can never be undone by white colonial invasion, and the loss of culture and the loss of stories. There's a part that I think was just horrific where they talked about those, I think it was like 10 story men, so sort of elders from community, when there were white colonial sort of powers in a community who said that they wanted to meet with these story men. So they took these 10 story men to a meeting and they killed them all. And they were the holders of the stories. There was no written language. Stories were passed down through generations through language, and essentially in however amount of time it took to kill these 10 people, that erased culture that could have been passed down. And so whilst this book discusses the darkest aspects of Australian history and the deep injustice done to First Nations people, I thought it was written in such a way that really feels that Deborah was guiding us, and the readers who, like me, who may not be First Nations people, she was guiding us through the pain and violence, but also showing us the joy and connection that comes from living on and with the land and with its deep, deep history. So I thought it was a beautiful book. I absolutely loved it.
Agree. Yeah, I thought it was quite generous actually in the way that she wrote things. I've read quite a lot of books by First Nations people, and they sort of, it's completely up to them, of course, how they wish to write it, but some of them, they sort of write for different audiences, and I think she was very generous in the way that she writes it. I love this as well. I found it quite disparate, I have to say. Like it covers a lot of different topics in quite a dreamlike way, and sort of circles around different things and comes. It's sort of interesting. It sort of circles around different points in her life and the way that she focuses in. She's focusing in on like quite specific moments in sort of like snippets or vignettes almost, I suppose. And it's not linear, really. It sort of moves around quite a lot. Writing was really beautiful, and it's also, I think, the only one that I took highlights from, I think, in the whole shortlist as well. It's got, I think, definitely the strongest writing. I actually read out loud during the long list episodes that we did with Sean. I did read out loud a part of this as well. And I thought I have another section that I want to read out loud, actually, because you were reading out about those bits about the First Nation experience, which are also incredibly beautiful. But she also writes about the death of both of her parents, and she talks about how different that was in both circumstances. So she, like, with her mum, she's basically got like a lot to say, and she writes this like long beautiful passage. I'll actually read a bit of it because it's very, very beautiful. So this is from a sort of vignette that's called An Ending, which is purely about the death of her mother. And it starts, I thought I knew what pain was, but then my mum died. I felt the unanesthetized and raw slashing of the cord that day, and it was only at that moment that all the pain I imagined I knew and had known became real. The cracking of multiple bones, including 3 in my spine and 2 ribs, while breaking in my horse, the cutting out of tonsils, the numerous moments of slashed flesh during childhood accidents, and the birthing of my 10.5-pound son, all lived in that moment and coalesced into a soul-deep, tearing wound defined by, but unable to be contained in, my mother's passing. I felt that my life was truly my own in that moment, and I wasn't ready, and I didn't want it, and I understood the horror of a single separate story that focused on me. And so that's quite a long, that vignette. It's about 3 pages. And then when her father dies, she says something like, I don't know how to talk about my dad no longer being here. It is too big.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. The one that I read last night, actually, I haven't quite finished this one, but there's a beautiful section about her dad. Yeah, and he's talking about the experience of the people of her area, how they sort of experience Europeans and how they were fearful of Europeans. But there's a line that I found so beautiful, which is that he feared the effects on his daughters, but he was terrified for his children who were to be born into this place far into the future. And she talks a lot about intergenerational trauma, and I thought it was really beautiful. I really, really liked this.
I read this book first. I think I bought it at a local bookshop when it was long listed and then hoped that it was. I didn't start it until the shortlist was announced, but had intended to read it either way. And as I was reading it, I was regretting reading it first because I thought surely I won't be savouring each passage in the rest of the books like I am in this. So I think that probably speaks multitudes to where it was on my ranking.
Lovely. Yeah, this was a banger. Very unique. Really, really liked it. So let's talk about the next one, shall we? So the next one is Hydra by Adrian Howell, which I think I've talked about. I feel like I was currently reading it at some point in the last couple of months. So if you're a regular listener to the pod, I'm sure you would have heard about me talking about it before. But so Adrian Howell lives in Melbourne, and this is about a woman who is an antique dealer, and she sort of has a bit of a breakdown at work, I guess. She actually attacks a client. Because she really wants a bit of an antique chair that this client won't sell. And then she ends up basically being fired in disgrace, and ends up moving to a country town. She actually leases, I believe, a house that the army owns or the navy owns. And this is sort of a weird abandoned sort of cottage in this rural town. And it has rumors of ghosts and that kind of thing. So she's sort of trying to get her life back in order. She's like this disgraced antiquarian. She's living in this sort of weird rural town that's got almost nothing in it, and there's this ghost that's sort of tormenting her. And it's quite an odd combination of being a book set in Australia. There's a lot of discussion about like Queen Anne furniture. It reminded me a little bit of Jane Rawson's From the Wreck, actually, which is another Australian novel. Yeah, so premise-wise, I liked this. I have to say, in terms of the execution of the novel, I ended up being a little bit disappointed by it. I really liked the idea of the story. I liked the components of the story, and I liked the individual bits. But when it came to actually like reading the novel and there being a story, I felt like I was kind of left wanting with this one.
I think it picked up pace for me at the end. I initially, when I had started reading it, and she was an antiques dealer, and it was talking in detail about the different departments in the auction house where she worked, I was a little bit like, okay, here we go. This is going to take me a little while to get through. And then that incident with the chair and her getting fired happened, and it picked up speed. And I think so. What she'd bought a house, but it was basically a 100-year lease type
Yeah.
situation. Like it was government land and it was on a naval base. So it was like on the coast, sitting on the top of a cliff, basically, is how I'd pictured it
Yeah.
at least, or sort of overlooking the sea. And that there was this ghost or this like enigma, this presence that was haunting the property. I think I really enjoyed that concept, that there was something and we were going to find out what it was. And so it picked up pace. It sort of just played on that idea, I think, of that Australian country folklore that I think is probably in a lot of other Australian writing, but I guess that comes out of maybe the solitude of a lot of country areas in Australia, and that there are these sort of stories that come with the places. People had blamed accidents or blamed like incidents in the past on this thing, on this sort of ghost or this person or this animal or this monster or whatever that was supposed to be haunting this area and this house. Hydra, I think, was the name of the boat that was like parked against the house.
Yeah.
She turned them into a garden bed.
Yeah, I think that had something to do with this. I did find the actual myth quite confusing. I think it had something to do with the person who was supposed to be the ghost.
But are we allowed to spoiler?
Let's not spoil anything.
Okay. So I was disappointed, I guess, with the reveal of what this ghost monster thing haunting the property was. And I guess it was left up in the air as to whether it was actually something that she was really experiencing or whether it was like a trick of her mind. But it was definitely something that had been experienced by other people in the area as well. So
I feel like it needed to be longer, actually. Sort of felt like it was only getting going, or change the ratio of where she is for different parts of the book. But the pacing of it was a little odd.
It felt like two separate books. Like the first bit, I think, went on for maybe too long.
Yeah.
Especially considering she got fired from that job, and that was really only like her taking off. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I have to be honest, I was surprised that it was on the shortlist. Not that I've read other books on the long list, but sort of reading it in isolation, it was just one of those books that is surprising that it's made it to a literary shortlist. To be perfectly honest. But your reading of it is definitely more generous than mine. So yeah, so I was a bit like, okay, fine. I think I don't read a lot of Australian fiction, and I feel like you've got a good excuse for not reading it because most of the time you are living in the Netherlands and don't have it easily accessible as I do. So I think I enjoyed it because it was talking about a peninsula that I think I am familiar with. Like I can picture the area where it is set. I always find that sort of nice and refreshing. And I did enjoy that sort of little bit of Australian folklore, sort of, drop bears and hoop snakes. And
I do wish I read more Australian stuff. So I was really glad. I mean, this is sort of a side note, but yeah, I was really glad to read the shortlist actually. And I want to sort of spend more time actually reading Australian stuff because I'm so out of the loop in terms of what's going on in Australian publishing and whatnot.
So the next book on the shortlist was Bad Art Mother by Edwina Preston. This book explores what life was like for female creatives in the 60s, a time when publishing and the art world were entirely a men's club. So it's set in Melbourne. The novel is written from the perspective of Owen, who is the young son of Veda, who is an aspiring poet, or a yet to be published poet. Through his memories of his mother's struggle between her two worlds, her creative role and her maternal role, it's obvious to the reader that these roles are mutually exclusive for Veda. Owen's recollection of Veda's neglect in her maternal role were uncomfortable to read at times, made more so by his undying love and sort of concern for his mother as a small child, watching her failures and her being tormented by her failures. Alongside his parents, Owen is cared for by his aunt and a wealthy couple called Mr. and Mrs. Parrish, who are a childless couple who come into Owen's life and essentially take guardianship of him at quite a young age, caring for him on weekends and providing him with every advantage money can buy. This is a transaction that was sort of uncomfortable to read about basically enabled Veda to pursue her creative career and providing Owen with a sort of safe haven, I guess, in the parish's weekend home at the expense of, I think, his like sense of security and place. Because he moves homes basically every few days throughout this entire novel. He's quite young. I think he's maybe 6 or 7 when the novel starts, up to maybe 10, 11 years of age. His care's split between his parents, which is mostly his mum, as his dad works nights at his restaurant, his aunt Ornelia, and the parishes. So there are sort of 3 women who embody maternal roles in Owen's life. His memories throughout this book include snapshots of Melbourne, which I found really enjoyable and that I've only heard of through my own parents' childhood growing up in this city in the 60s, well, more in the 70s, and when Melbourne's art world and restaurant scene were blossoming, which are 2 big components of this book. I really love this book. I thought the form and structure really fit the intention of the novel. So it's written from Owen's perspective, from a young child's perspective in second person. And he's talking about, he says you a lot. And the you that he frequently mentions is his aunt, Ornelia, who's the real true maternal figure in his childhood. She's childless. She's a nurse. She's not a creative. And I think the message in this book is that, as from his perspective, and maybe not willingly, he's sort of saying that they're mutually exclusive, being a mother and being creative, like, and being nurturing and being creative in his life. There wasn't a crossover. So most of the book is written as a memoir of his childhood, with interspaced chapters from him in the present day. He's attempting to have his mother's work published posthumously. Her work now ironically being viewed as revolutionarily feminist, writing of the struggles of the mundane and the domesticated mother. So I think the form allowed the reader to experience sort of the neglect, lack of security that Owen felt being shifted between homes and maternal figures, with accounts of his mother's ineptitude, I guess, to fulfill her maternal role, but also Owen's sort of discomfort and secondhand heartbreak as he watches his mother's constant rejections and often sort of, I think, sort of manic and then depressive episodes. I think this might have been my favourite book and maybe my pick, if I can say that already, for the winner. When I read it, I think I instantly messaged you once I'd finished it. I still remember where I was sitting when I finished it when I was overseas. And I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. I just thought it was everything I think they were talking about when they, the sort of CEO of Stella, in those quotes I mentioned earlier. One of the quotes that I didn't say earlier, but the Jacqueline Booten, the creative director and co-CEO of Stella, also said that these 6 books deftly interrogate balance of hope and grief, the creative and the domestic, the life-altering and the mundane. And I feel like she was directly talking about what Bad Art Muffet did there in that quote. And so this was my pick for the win.
Yeah, I think it's
I
phenomenal.
absolutely loved it.
Actually, this was really outstanding. I really love this as well. It's a really challenging book, I think, in many ways. Probably, so prose-wise, it's a little bit challenging, but I think conceptually and the ideas in this novel are really, really challenging, and she really subverts a lot of stuff in this novel. So you have this woman who is, at the end of the day, a really bad parent. Like, both of the parents are really bad parents. And it's a really interesting juxtaposition to have in the current day. You have this like thinker that people look up to who said all this stuff, and who's so feminist and is so revolutionary, and the contrast of this person, their personal life, who is honestly a neglectful parent whose child is suffering, and his child feels unloved, and his child doesn't know how to deal with his mother and doesn't, everything is about sort of trying to please his mother, trying to get love from his mother. And it was such I think, an interesting look at the separation between the art and the artists, and also this idea of people that we admire and what they are in real life and what that actually means. Some of the stuff on page here is really uncomfortable. What actually happens to this child is really grey, and it's really uncomfortable, and it's really, really interesting. I think I would definitely recommend this for a book club or something, because I think there's so much in here to talk about. And so Owen essentially has three mothers, and his father as well. Yeah, so he sort of has five parental figures basically, and the way that they all deal with him is completely different. They all do things. They are all absolutely imperfect, and they all want to love him and want to look after him in such different ways. And it's such an interesting look at the effect each of these sort of techniques, I guess, or approaches have on him, how he deals with each of them independently, and what happens to him in the long term, like with all of these people who approach him and love him in completely, I want to say, orthogonal ways. Like, it's also unique.
I found it so difficult, and I feel that I didn't even summarize. I couldn't summarize this book when I was trying to think of like a nice way to pack together what happens. Because as you said, there's so many characters that play a key role, and Owen being the center of basically like all these moving parts. I really thought it was like that. I really liked it was only really a couple of chapters when he's older, and he ends up being in a relationship with a publisher who's going to publish his mother's work in the present day. And I think a little bit down the track, they're discussing that they've been in a relationship now for several years and they don't want children, because this lady that he's in a relationship with has decided that she doesn't want children, and that's fine, and that's how they're going about life. And I think he sort of verbalizes or questions or has a thought about the fact that I wonder if my mother was afforded this choice, or like maybe she didn't actually want children, or maybe she shouldn't have had children. He had that sort of thought that came in his mind from watching his own life, sort of, and then I guess reflecting on his childhood. It was really, really uncomfortable to read, but very well done. And I think it was right up my alley. I think it ticked all the boxes of things that I love about reading sort of memoirs of people's childhood, that lack of stability that he didn't have in his life and what that meant for him.
For me, one of the most interesting sort of themes of this was the sort of gendered parenting aspect of it, where she has a mother and a father, both of whom are not good parents. And the way that the mother is perceived, the amount of intervention that there is on the mother compared to the father, who is sort of, he's very different, but he's neglectful in the same way. Neither of them are involved, neither of them are very active as parents. And just how she's looking at the disparity between these two things, and how the mother, how Vida is kind of vilified, and how the father is sort of seen as like, well, he's just trying his best. Like,
but he's not home, like, and he's basically not present in this child's life either. But they're like, Vida's sort of like, Vida, like her parental privileges are slowly being taken away by, that family, including the father, sort of saying, oh, you're not fit to look after Owen, and she's sort of taken back to like 2 days and then maybe one night a week where she can have Owen. But yes, and it's
it was interesting because the father was so absent. I don't even know. I couldn't work out if they were together or not.
I couldn't work out if he lived in the same house.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Yeah, I couldn't work out where he lived because he's so absent.
But he's also present there are a lot of scenes with Owen in his restaurant. So the parishes, as well as sort of funding Owen and having him as their heir, as like a childless couple, also I think put a lot of money into his restaurant, which then grows to be a big, like well-known restaurant in Melbourne in that time. And there's scenes of Owen visiting the restaurant after school, but not really present, and he's not really vilified for not being present in Owen's life either. So
yeah, it was super interesting. I thought this was phenomenal. As I said, I loved this. Wonderful. The next one is Big Beautiful Female Theory by Eloise Grills, which is kind of like a graphic novel, I guess, or illustrated non-fiction. So there's a lot of text in it, but it has very large illustrations throughout, and it's essentially, yeah, so it's non-fiction, so there's all bits parts of sort of like independent writing in it. There's sort of essays in it, there's little short form poetry, there's long form poetry, there's little sort of vignettes, there's all sorts of stuff, all basically around the theme of bodies, I would say, and particularly women's bodies and how they are perceived, and what is beauty, I suppose, and what is, yeah, that, anything else? How would you describe it?
No, I think that's pretty spot on. I felt that the themes were quite repetitive,
Mm.
um, and it was existing in a world where in in a larger body in modern times when a larger body is not the beauty standard that, as a young child or as a teenager or as a young adult that you aspire to, or that the public aspires to. And so I think it was, yeah, I don't really know what to say about this book because I didn't really enjoy it, and I'm not sure whether it was the form, like being a graphic novel. I don't read graphic novels. This is the first novel like this I've read. I actually went to look at why it was in the Stella, which is when I found that like an illustrated book can be included as long as it has a what it was very vague about it. It just said a substantial text. Yeah, which it definitely has, and it could be just a book of its own right without being an illustrated book. But I found the illustrations really beautiful, but I did just find the themes quite repetitive. Person's perspective, I guess, that being the author, and I'm not sure if it could have maybe explored more aspects of being in different types of bodies. Like, is it like it could have broadened the theme of that? So not just living in a larger body, but living in a body with other sort of aspects that didn't conform with the stereotypical perfect ideal body. I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I just sort of read it, to be honest with you, and I think it was the form, for me for sure. I've read quite a few graphic novels. It's not particularly a form that I enjoy that much, and I find, I don't know, I'm a bit weird with pictures. I don't know where to look. Like I don't know. I sort of get that thing that people talk about with art galleries, which I don't experience, but they're like, oh, I don't know how long to look at the painting. I don't have that in art galleries, but I do have it with graphic novels, where I'm like, is this enough? I don't know. So I find them quite hard to engage with, actually.
It was quite sizable as well, the book. I thought like it was quite thick and quite big, and I felt like I was just reading it, getting through it, and then every now and then thinking, oh, should I be thinking more about? It felt like one very long thought process to me. I don't know
Yeah,
if
I just sort of, when I finished it, I was like, okay. I have to say there wasn't much in there. So I should have probably said this in the introduction. It is explicitly about being fat, which I have read quite a lot about before. Obviously, it's not an and there's just nothing in it particularly that I found like new, or I sort of had the feeling as I was reading it that I'd read stuff exactly like this before. So there was nothing in it particularly that struck me. That could just be me being a bit arrogant, willing to take that criticism on board if that is true. But yeah, that was my genuine reaction to it.
Yeah, I was waiting for a nuanced sort of or more exploration. I thought, there was some beautiful sort of reflections on living in a bigger body. It didn't strike me as something that I would read again or take away
Yeah.
or tell other people to read. And I can't quite put my finger on why. And maybe the pictures were distracting in that. I really don't know where this sits on my list of.
Yeah, I think for me, mostly it's just like it's not a stayer. You know what I mean? Like in a year's time, I'm going to struggle to give you any more detail than even the vague detail I'm giving you now. I only read it a couple of weeks ago.
I read it only a couple of days ago. This is like the last one on my list. I didn't take it away with me because it was too big and heavy. I can't tell you any more than I've just said. Yeah, I think it's an important topic, important concept. I like representation in media, in writing. I think we should read more from people who have different life experiences than ourselves. But I don't know if it expanded into that realm for me. Like I do just feel like it was a book about one person's life living in a larger body.
Speaking of important issues, let's talk about indelible cities. Indelible City.
Indelible City. So, Indelible City by Louisa Lim, Dispossession and Defiance in Hong Kong is a little subtext. Louisa Lim is a half Chinese reporter who'd grown up in Hong Kong and covered the region as a reporter for a decade. I read a little bit about her. She decided during the 2019 protests, which had gained international attention, that this would be the impetus for her to write this novel, which is part non-fiction, and I think there is an element of memoir throughout it. She was reporting on Hong Kong's history from the British takeover in the 1840s to its return to China in 1997 and up until basically the 2019 protests, which were televised globally. It's the history of Hong Kong, and a history that Louisa felt was incompletely documented, its origins obscured by myths. So during British reign of the region, it was sort of taught in schools that Hong Kong was a barren rock before becoming a British territory and a powerhouse of trade and shipping. And then after being turned over back to the Chinese, so basically being given back to China from Britain, China stated that it had always been part of Chinese territory. The British had taken it and then at last returned it. Louisa investigates Hong Kong's identity through its history, what it means to be a Hong Konger. And she follows this history through to the 2019 protests, which she says, and this is a quote, were both the coming of age of the Hong Kong people and the beginning of its end. She reflected on her position as both a journalist and a Hong Konger during this latter part of the book. In terms of what I thought about this, I'm not a massive fan of nonfiction, and whilst I felt that the premise was exciting to me, like quite a politically interesting and hot topic, which I knew nothing about, so I was in a way looking forward to reading it. I did pick it up from the library, read a few pages, and then decided to give it a go listening to it as an audiobook. So I felt that it might be a bit too dry for someone who doesn't read a lot of nonfiction, because it does read a lot like a history book. There's little elements which I really enjoyed throughout it where it's more memoirs of her childhood growing up. So she had a English parent, I believe, and then her father was Chinese and they grew up in Hong Kong, as in she, as a child, grew up in Hong Kong. And her mother was very interested in Hong Kong history. And as part of, in Louisa's childhood, they lived near, or there was something about like a grave, what do you call them? Cemetery. And she was documenting like the lives of the people that were at this cemetery and essentially making like a information packet, because there were a lot of British soldiers and sort of notable people that were buried there. So I liked those aspects of like Louisa's memoir throughout there. I found a lot of the history a little bit dry. The audiobook did make it go down a bit smoother because it read by her. The part that I did really enjoy was, I'm not sure if you got to this point, but the King of Kowloon, which was basically a man who believed himself to be the rightful heir of Kowloon, which was an area of the peninsula opposite Hong Kong Harbour. He believed that this land belonged to his family and had been stolen from them by the British in the 19th century. And no one could say for sure why he believed this. There was a quote that says, but his conviction became a mania. And so in the mid-1950s, he would walk the streets messily graffitiing calligraphy, which were declarations of rightful ownership, basically saying that he was the King of Kowloon and that this property and this land should be returned back to him. He would only graffiti public property that was owned by like the monarchy, like by British, so like telephone boxes or sides of buildings that were like government owned. And it became like an urban legend. And so people have this memory, people who live in Hong Kong have this memory of seeing him as a child, seeing his sort of figure shuffling around the streets or painting on the sides of buildings. So I enjoyed the history of him. He then became, as he grew older, he had to be put in a home and he ended up dying. And his art then, like it often is, was preserved. So, doors or things that he'd written on posters, etc. Sort of were memorialized and put in galleries. And so there was that section of the novel that was about him, and I found that quite interesting. But otherwise, it did read in sections like a history book, and it lost me a little bit there.
Yeah, I think as you've just alluded to, I didn't finish it. So this one, I found this, I will be honest, really boring. I was really looking
Yeah.
forward to reading this because I'm interested in Hong Kong. Actually, my partner lived there for a little while, and it's a yeah. So I find it really interesting. And yeah, I'm really really interested in Hong Kong. But good lord, I'm just gonna be honest. I don't know how she made such an interesting topic so boring. And even that part that you were just talking about, the King of Kowloon. I was reading. I did read that bit, and I was just reading it, thinking, "How did you make an underground graffiti artist with a mysterious past this dry?" I don't know.
I think the only way that I got through it when you're talking about it, I'm agreeing with you, and I think it was because it was an audiobook, and so I was passively absorbing it.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm being harsh, but I found this honestly quite excruciating. So I didn't finish it. But it is an interesting topic, and it did sort of make me think. I feel like I think I said this before, maybe on the pod, but I do sometimes feel like nonfiction books are given accolades for the fact that they are about a topic that's really interesting and important, which of course Hong Kong is absolutely. But that doesn't make a book about Hong Kong good. And I do feel that this one has been given maybe a bit of a boost because it is a really important topic. I'm really sorry. I know that's a horrible thing to say, but that's how I feel. Like I'm being very harsh. But also I'm thinking about this book in the context of the we're talking about this book in the context of a literary prize. So I'm being probably a
Yeah.
little bit more harsh than I would be if I just read it on the fly. But
I think the only parts that pull it through from that, like in the context of the Stella Prize, are the parts that are part memoir. I think especially towards the end of the book, she talks about she actively, with her two daughters, I think she's got two children, was part of the protests in 2019, and she decided not to cover them as a reporter, but instead to actually attend them and stand for 9 hours in the streets. And it was a really nice part where a person in front of her in the protest turned and sort of said, what are foreigners doing protesting? And she said, I'm half Chinese. My children are 3/4 Chinese. I've grown up in Hong Kong. I'm a Hong Kong resident. We're all here for the same reason. And the person sort of thanked her and thanked her children for being part of it. And she talked about that experience and being part of the protests. And she realized that she couldn't actually separate who she was as a Hong Konger from the fact that she was a reporter. It was in that moment that she decided that she needed to write about this and write about Hong Kong's history. I was excited about it at the start. I was excited about the end. I struggled in the middle of it, because at the start she talks about how she has to change the identities of the people that she spoke to so that they don't get, there's all the laws about not talking about the government, etc. And I was like, oh, juicy.
yeah, she talked a big game.
Yeah, and then I don't know where that was in there.
All right, last one. Let's talk about the Jaguar. So the last one is The Jaguar by Sarah Holland Bass. This is the one that won. Congratulations to Sarah. So we're recording this obviously just after the winner was announced. And this is the only book of poetry on the shortlist. Last year, actually, a book of poetry also won Drop Bear. This book is about Sarah's experience of her father being diagnosed with Parkinson's, and how he is diagnosed with it, how his Parkinson's starts to affect him, sort of the breakdown of her father's body, I suppose, as the Parkinson's starts to take hold, and then what happens when he eventually dies. I'm just going to read out the little blurb. I generally don't like it when people do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm sorry. With electrifying boldness, Hollenbat confronts what it means to be mortal in an astonishing and deeply humane portrait of a father's Parkinson's disease and a daughter forged by grief. Yeah. So tell me, what did you think of this one?
I initially struggled with it, but not almost because it was too good.
Mm-hmm.
The first part, so it's in 3 parts.
I think 4.
I believe 4. The first, I didn't make it past the first. I can tell you exactly the poem I made it up to, which is called The Gift, which was my favorite poem. It is about her father in hospital dying. And this was not 2 weeks after I had gone through the process of walking my grandfather through the palliative process. As a medical family member, that took me into the center of my family dealing with the process of his dying, me being the advocate for this, and spending a lot of time talking palliative care, talking dying, talking death, and watching him die. So it was a lot. And I think at some point I messaged you and said I might have to not read this book because it was beautiful, but it was a bit much. And you very graciously said if you have to DNF a book for that reason, I would DNF this book for that reason. But I did go back to it later. I'm interested to hear your thoughts before I talk about the fact that I was lucky enough to go to a event as part of the Melbourne Writers Festival, which was the chair of the 2023 Stella Prize judging panel, Alice Hung, and Sarah Holland, that in conversation as part of the Stella Prize winner event.
All right. I haven't actually finished this one. Oh, sorry. I'm about halfway through it, and it's kind of funny because I've been reading it for quite a while, and I've only read 55 pages of it, and that's because these poems it kind of demands slowness. I would say there's something in the way that it's written that makes you really slow down, which is actually something I don't think I've experienced with poetry before. Most of the time that I've read poetry, I do have that feeling of thinking like, oh yeah, I've got to think about this properly, and but this is the first time I think I've read a collection that made me feel that I should be reading it slowly. If you know what I mean. It wasn't my own thoughts. um yeah, I'm really, really enjoying it. I also love The Gift. That poem was beautiful. There's also one called The Gurney, I think, which I found really, really moving, which was about a moment in the hospital where where she sees a gurney because someone has died, and she has this moment of panic thinking it's her father, and then realizing that it's not her father and that he's alive, and she has that sort of horrible thought that many of us have, which is like, oh, thank God it's someone else's death, which you see every time there's like a car accident that could be someone that you know, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. It's kind of funny because I am a neuroscientist and I study the areas of the brain that are I don't study Parkinson's disease itself, but I study the areas of the brain that are affected by Parkinson's. And it is really interesting to read. She actually talks about some of these regions in poetic form, which is really interesting. So it was funny to read a poem about the substantia nigra, which is such a it's kind of like my work life. And she even like describes an MRI poetically. Yeah, so I'm really, really enjoying it, and I have someone who doesn't read poetry and who is enjoying it and feeling like I'm actually getting a lot out of it, and not having that feeling. Often when I read poetry, I have a feeling of like, oh, you have to slow down and you've got to think about this, and it's sort of making me do this itself. So it's I'm finding it quite a unique experience actually for a book of poems.
And I think you have to be in the right frame of mind to want to slow down to really absorb it as well, which I think is partly why I was struggling with it at the start as well, that I felt like I couldn't give it the brain space to appreciate it. But yes, no, I have also not completely finished it. Still, I think I've got a few more to go. The title, The Jaguar, there's a poem with that title in here, which is talking about as part of his Parkinson's disease, you can become impulsive. Often people become gamblers and gamble their life savings away and make impulsive decisions. Her father didn't do this, but he decided to create an eBay account and buy on eBay a 1980s vintage Jaguar car, sight unseen. And the first that his family, like Sarah and her mother, knew about it was when it arrived at the house. And I loved this poem. And Sarah talked about it at the event, and she said that at the time it was not funny at all, because they were so worried. He had basically been told that by the doctor that he needed to stop driving to give his license up, and then he went and bought this car. And he would drive it around and speed along highways, and they refused to get in it. They were sure he was going to kill himself and everyone else on the road as well. So it's only funny in hindsight. And she said, but it was it is funny now to think about it. And it gave him so much joy and so much happiness in a time where her father was a very clever man, a man who prized himself on his knowledge. He used to write classical music as a hobby. I think she said he was an engineer. Oh no, he was he worked with like rocks and stones and I think like big drills. They lived in the Gold Coast in Queensland and in an area of the Gold Coast where people didn't have big literary libraries full of, poems and of these great novels that her father encouraged her to read, and he really enjoyed talking to her about reading and books and poems. She sort of accredits him with the reason that she's a poet today. And so for someone like that to get Parkinson's, which is a degenerative disease where he completely understood what his future was going to look like. And it progressed over, he was diagnosed when she was 18. I think she said it was about like a 12-year span until he died. But during this time when he bought the Jaguar car, he was happy and it just brought him so much joy. And it was really interesting hearing her talk about it. But basically it was this beautiful pristine car, and then what he started doing as part of this strange impulsive behavior was that he started to tinker with it. And so she says she's describing the car as miraculous and sleek until he started to tinker, painted the leather seats with acrylic so they peeled and cracked, jacked the gear stick, hacked a hole into the dash with a Stanley knife, jury-rigged the driver's seat so it sat so low you couldn't see over the dash. So he then went and sort of destroyed this beautiful vintage car by sort of tinkering with it. Anyway, I just thought it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poem.
I really liked the one where he gets deep brain stimulation. So he gets an electrode planted in the area of the brain that's damaged in Parkinson's, which is, it's just so interesting to read. I just really enjoyed actually reading it about this kind of stuff from a completely different perspective, like from a non-medical, non-academic perspective. I really enjoyed it. Actually, I should say my grandfather actually had Parkinson's disease. It sort of started off my interest, I suppose, in like neuroscience and motor. So I studied motor control. Yeah, and it was kind of stimulated, I suppose, by my grandfather, watching his degeneration and seeing him change so much. With his, well, he was diagnosed before I was born, but it was, obviously had a big impact on me. So I found this really, I was thinking of my grandfather a lot as I was reading this, and he and I are actually quite similar. So yeah.
Sarah Hollenbat, her father lived in an aged care home for quite a number of years, and she is quite extensively involved in aged care advocacy, which I didn't know, and she talked about quite a lot during the event. And so that is something that is a big part of her life that has come out of her dad having Parkinson's disease and their experiences with care and with people who do the caring work, the caretakers who are the caretakers both in families and the caretakers whose jobs are to care for people are predominantly women.
Mm-hmm.
It is predominantly underpaid or non-paid work, and she's a really huge advocate in the sort of the caring sphere. And I just thought, what a beautifully eloquent person to have in a role where she's trying to enact real change. The Gift, she said, was her favourite poem as well. The Gift is talking about the gift of a good death. She said that she talked about her father having a really, really horrible, 10 years of decline with his illness, but he was able to have a good death, which I think is something that if you've walked anyone through dying and death or watched anyone that you love die is a really important, really valuable thing.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to read a little bit of that poem. He holds the gift of death in his lap, small, oblong, wrapped in black. He has been waiting 17 years to open it and is impatient. I want to give him his present, but it is not mine to give. We sit as if mother and son on Christmas Eve, waiting for midnight to tick over, anticipating the moment we can open his present together. First my father holding it up to his ear and shaking it, then me helping him peel back the paper, the weight of his death knocking. And once the box is unwrapped, it will be mine. I will carry the gift of his death endlessly. Every day I will know it opening in me. And I just thought that was possibly the most beautiful poem I've read. I loved it.
It's a really beautiful metaphor as well, the box, opening the box. I really loved it.
And once, yeah, and just her being, now that's hers to carry and not his anymore. A worthy winner, yeah.
Okay, lovely. Yeah, I was going to ask you, what did you think of it being the winner? Would you have given it to Bad Art Mother, do you think?
I would have before hearing her talk.
Okay, interesting.
I think. Yeah.
She's won you over.
She won me over. I think she won me over. And yeah, the judge's report described The Jaguar as accessible, lyrical, and wise. This is a book from a poet at the height of her powers. And I think that's the thing, that these poems are all very accessible, and maybe what you were talking about before, that they make you as a reader want to take time to read them.
I sort of had a feeling that this would have been actually from when I watched the long list announcement, because one of the judges, the male judge, I can't remember his name, he was holding it and he was waving it at the audience and he said, "You can read this book. Don't be scared of it. You must read it." Like, it was so, he obviously just, like, it obviously spoke to him. So yeah, I thought it was really funny. He sort of turned into like a booktuber. It's like, read this book. It was funny. Yeah, I think I agree that this is a really worthy winner. I think I probably would have, as a judge, probably gone for Bad Art Mother. I do feel, in terms of being a prize about the experience of like women and non-binary people in Australia, I think I would have gone for I would have been advocating for Bad Art Mother.
I think so too. I think Bad Art Mother would have been my winner, but I can also see why this won. I think it's interesting to have a book of poetry win 2 years in a row as well.
Yeah. I haven't read Drop Bear, and I will eventually.
I haven't either, and I maybe... No, to be honest, I don't really have much of an intention of reading it because I'm not a massive poetry reader, but
I love the honesty.
But maybe I will now after loving this.
I have to say, also, We Come With This Place, I can also see a very, very strong argument for that winning. And that's also kind of an interesting, like, poetic book. Well, it's very poetic. It's sort of it's very lyrical.
I think maybe I would have ranked it Bad Art Mother, and then We Come With This Place and Jaguar as my equals.
That's my exact top 3. Shall I show you what I've written down here, like in countdown?
Yeah.
So you can see my working. Well, I don't know if you're going to be able to.
You can see it's real. You're not lying.
No, I'm not lying. And then I've put the other 3 sort of in the bottom. They're sort of interchangeable.
Hydra would have been next for me. I enjoyed that more, I think.
It was certainly for me a short list of 2 halves, of 3 hits and 3 misses for me. Interesting that the 3 that I really liked, I sort of would have been happy with any of them winning, and then the other 3, I can't imagine them, not in a month of Sundays, as they say. Can I imagine them winning? So it's kind of interesting. So yeah, I think that's the first time I've read the shortlist in its entirety for the Stella, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks. I know I complained, but thank you for the push. I'm really glad I read them all.
There you go. You're welcome.
Lovely. Well, I better go. I actually have to go out for dinner. Thank you so much, Belle. Really enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let us know what you thought of us covering the Stella. I know it's a prize we don't normally cover, so hopefully you enjoyed listening to some stuff about Australian writing. And let me know if you did. If there's other prizes as well that you think we might enjoy or that you would like to hear us talk about, I know we're going to cover the Women's Prize later in the year, and we'll cover the Booker, of course, as well. So if there's another prize, I don't know why I'm saying that. I'm sure Chris and Jenny are listening to this saying, "Sorry, who is Sarah volunteering to read a shortlist of?" Belle will do it. If you would like to support the podcast financially, we have a Patreon account. The links for that are in the show notes. You can also get in touch with us on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter. And we also have an email address. We are the Bookcast Club @outlook.com. And please contact us if you have questions, comments, concerns, ideas, thoughts, anything. Thank you so much for listening, and we will speak at you again in 2 weeks. Goodbye. You got to say bye. No one says bye.
Bye.